We're trying to accomplish two things today. One, to give the New York State offices, departments, divisions, authorities, campuses, and corporations reference materials and best practice for your procurement and contracting endeavors. Because though we are a control agency, and that state appropriation goes to the Department of Audit and Control, we're also public servants in civil service titles, and like you, we're a customer service organization. And you are our customers. We're doing this for you. And like any good customer service organization, goal number two, we're looking to develop relationships with our customers. So if you need help, you've got somebody to ask. We've got reference materials at the end of the presentation. But if you're stuck, call me. 518-486-1250. That goes to my desk, and it's now routed to my cell phone. I will answer. If I can't pick it up, I will call you back. I'll get you in contact with the team leader or audit staff responsible for your transaction, so don't be shy. Now you've got a contact at OSC. 518-486-1250. This is Randy McConaughey. I'm putting myself out there to help you get what you need, to help you document your procurement record so it explains who and how the awarded contractor was selected, and how the compensation was determined. At the highest level, procurement is about documenting who is getting an award and how much money are they getting. 518-486-1250. Who and how much. Please welcome Hannah Krzyzewski. Hannah will be your first presenter and will explain the plan for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. So, in order to provide the most useful training, OSC wanted agencies to tell us what you'd like to know about procurement. We reached out to over 180 procurement professionals statewide to find out what your most pressing questions are, what you'd like training on, and what you have the most difficulty procuring. We compiled as many questions as we could to focus on most frequently asked questions and questions that may be helpful for multiple agencies. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions, and we hope our responses will be helpful in crafting future procurements. As stated earlier, today we'll be answering your questions, which have been split into several categories. On our agenda today, we'll be discussing method of award, followed by evaluation of bids and proposals, then discretionary procurements. After that, we'll move to solicitation of interest, then price reasonableness. Our final topic today, other best practices, will include several important questions that do not neatly fit into the other categories. Throughout the presentation, if you have a question, please use the chat feature in WebEx. We'll try to address questions as we can, as time permits. Our first topic today is method of award with myself and Jenny Funk. So Jenny, our first question is, could you provide training on appropriate use of discretionary versus non-discretionary procurements and clarification of separating commodities and services at agency discretion? Jenny, can you give us an overview on discretionary versus non-discretionary procurement?
That's a great question, Hannah. Thank you. So it looks like the question, we're going to be discussing it in two parts. Difference between discretionary versus non-discretionary, and the differences between commodities and services. So let's take a look at part one. Discretionary procurements. That's an award where you don't have to compete because it's an informal process. What that means is you get to buy that item or service from who you want. So when you're ready to send that transaction into OSC, please document your process. Let us know. What was your agency's need? How many vendors respond to your advertisement? Who you picked and why you picked them? And how was their pricing deemed reasonable? Now, we understand this informal procurement is at your agency's discretionary threshold, but ultimately, we both want best value for the state. So let us know. Let us know why your agency determined this vendor is the most qualified to meet your agency's needs. Now, non-discretionary procurements is a competitive bid, and it's a formal process, which usually is going to be an IFP, which is an invitation for bid, or an RFP, which is a request for proposal. We will discuss this in more detail throughout this presentation. So let's go to the second item. What's the difference between a commodity versus service? So the question you're going to want to ask yourself is, Is what you're buying a tangible item? So let's say you're buying a truck. That's a commodity. You can touch it, you can see it. So the procurement vehicle is going to be an IFB because the lowest bid wins the award. But what if you're buying software customization? Now that's a service. So you're going to use an RFP or request for proposal because best value wins the award. Now an RFP should identify your agency's needs. Each bidder's submission will detail their solution to meet your needs. But it's up to you, the agency, to determine which bidder best articulated their solution to meet your needs. The onus is on the bidder to articulate their solution, but it's the responsibility of the evaluator to pull the information out of the bid for evaluation. Now, your RFP should explain to the bidder what your agency needs are. This is what we want to buy. The RFP will identify the desired qualities in a bidder, which are your desirables, also known as your criteria. The criteria weight or maximum points available will tell the bidder how important each criteria is to your agency. So further into the presentation, we're going to go further and discuss criteria breakdown into baby criteria. So let's talk about evaluation instructions and how it's going to help the evaluators to determine who's the most qualified vendor to provide these services. The evaluation instructions should kind of read like a how-to book. How to evaluate, how to calculate, and the evaluation instruction should mirror the RFP regarding criteria requirements and the assigned criteria weight. It should also explain to the evaluators what to look for, how to score, a point range for each baby criteria, and how to tally that baby criteria points for that final overall criteria score. So please include a lot of detail, both for the evaluator and within the OSC cover letter. The more information you provide helps your procurement get to approval that much quicker. So we have another question coming up, and I think, Hannah, you could probably help us out with this one. Our agency finds procuring scientific laboratory supplies particularly challenging. What does OSC recommend, as the OGS contract does not cover full catalogs of products? So it looks like they want to find out how to procure products not covered under the OGS contract. So Hannah, can you help us out with this?
Sure. So first of all, remember to check your preferred source offerings first. If the items you're looking for are not available through a preferred source, you have to check with OGS next. If OGS has a contract with a catalog of products and supplies similar to your agency's need, reach out to the OGS contract manager and work with them to see if the specific items needed can be added to the catalog. In order to determine if the item can be approved to be added, you'll need to check if the desired item to be added is within scope of the OGS contract, if it's under the award, and if there's price reasonableness justification. Possible reasons for non-approval would be that it isn't within scope, it's not allowed or included under the award, or because it's an item already offered by a preferred source. If what your agency needs is not available through either a preferred source or an OGS centralized contract, you'll have to conduct a competitive procurement. Commodities, such as laboratory supplies, should be procured via IFB based on lowest cost.
Thanks so much, Hannah. That's a lot of great information. We have another question for you. Could you provide IFB on RFP guidance on procuring maintenance services? So how to procure maintenance under an IFB and RFP, Hannah?
So how do we procure maintenance services? Well, the process to develop a solicitation, whether it's an IFB or RFP, starts with determining the agency needs and outlining specifications. What is it that you need maintained? Make sure your solicitation clearly states what your program area needs. Keep in mind, for equipment, the best time to negotiate the maintenance agreement is when you're initially purchasing the equipment. A procurement for equipment maintenance services may mention requirements such as being an authorized dealer for equipment for the manufacturer that produces the equipment, or some other similar requirement. Typically, for a best price maintenance contract, agencies will look at set price on scheduled maintenance, on emergency maintenance services, and the parts used to address the emergency maintenance. The key is to estimate quantities so all contractors are bidding on a level playing field. The quantity for the scheduled visit might be 2 visits per year, but for evaluation purposes, maybe you estimate a reasonable number of emergency hours, perhaps 20 hours, and you estimate an annual spend on emergency parts, perhaps $20,000. Then, when all bidders give a price, multiply by your estimated usage. You can choose the low bidder, and all contractors are being evaluated fairly. RFPs factor technical qualifications into the evaluation, and the goal is to procure the best quality at the most reasonable price. Most RFPs include mandatory or minimum qualifications that the vendor must meet. These should not be overly restrictive in order to encourage competition. An example of a restrictive requirement could be 10 years of experience in a particular field if it's not absolutely necessary to perform the work. That could be the case if the maintenance services you're looking for are related to cleaning priceless artwork, but it probably isn't needed for most maintenance services. RFPs generally include preferred or desired qualifications that are relevant to assessing the best qualified vendors or determining the best solution for a particular scope of work. In either case, the method of award should be clear in the procurement. Vendors should know at least whether the award is based on lowest cost, or if not, the weight of technical versus cost. Detailed guidance can be found in the Procurement Council guide. Further guidance is available on the OSC website through past presentations. Additionally, we've provided links to other resources at the end of this presentation. Our next question for today is, how do we develop a scope of work? Kenny, could you share your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Hannah. So how to develop a scope of work? First thing you want to think of is the contract shop or the contract management specialist needs to start with a definition of success. Your agency must support how do they intend to pay for it. Procurement shop, the scope should meet programs needs. So the program department because you want to current scope. So your scope of work objectives. Identify the objectives of the procurement. What are your agency requirements and needs? Identify to the vendor what your agency expectations are. How will their responsibilities be met? Will there be deliverables or will there be milestones? A well-detailed scope helps you develop a clear evaluation instrument. The scope should be a mirror to your evaluation instrument. Assign weights to the various criteria and baby criteria. And the scope should include a lot of detail because complete transparency could lead to a well-informed bidder's understanding and deciding if they are or are not qualified bidders. So your scope also will help you determine your agency need, both for the technical and the cost evaluation. So let's imagine it's a replacement contract. Your technical scope. Review the prior contract and check with your program department just to be sure the scope hasn't changed. So let's take a look at the cost scope if it's a replacement contract. What I recommend is use the historical data available. Were product items and job titles accurate? How was it paid previously? Was it bi-hourly or monthly? Did it work well or does it need to be changed and tweaked? So let's imagine it's a completely new product or a completely new service to your agency. So the technical scope. Since the current market is constantly changing, I recommend doing a market research to see how industry typically bills for this service, to make sure you're asking for something that is realistic. Now, this will be discussed further in the solicitation of interest section. Now, the cost scope for a completely new product or service, how much money did your agency forecast to their budget examiner? When their finance office put together their budget for next year, how much was set aside for the service? Now, these are decent starting points to start an estimated value, which will be used for evaluation purposes only. But it will get everyone on the same level playing field. So a clear scope of work should help you get the most qualified, responsive, and responsible bids possible.
Okay, we have a question from the audience that Randy's going to answer for us. The question specifically is, can we do a catalog order on an invitation for bid with a percentage off? If there are so many items, it would be impossible to pick out everything that might be needed over a 1 to 5 year period. So one specific approach that you can take is a market basket. Randy, would you like to talk about the market basket approach?
Sure. A market basket is a representative sample of all the types of things you would be purchasing from that particular vendor. So it's unrealistic when you don't know all the different products that you might need. Say the catalog contains 200 items. You may or may not need all of them. One way to do it is to create a mini sample as if you were placing an order. Vendors bid a discount on a typical type of order. So you take items with a reasonable volume across all the categories that you're looking for, request a discount off of a typical order, a market basket, and then that pricing, that discount, can then be applied to everything in the catalog. As long as your solicitation document explains that that's what the plan is and that you're creating this market basket for evaluation purposes only, that's one way of getting a volume discount on a catalog when they're only going to bid on a couple of different items.
Thank you, Randy. That's a lot of great information. We received another question. How can we incorporate desirables into a best value procurement? Jenny, could you share your thoughts?
Thanks, Hannah. Desirables. Those are those nice to haves, but it's not a must-have requirement like a pass-fail. A desirable is what is beneficial to the performance of the service. Those desirables, as mentioned, are nice to have to make the contract successful. Now, there will be points associated with the desirables, and this point system will separate more qualified bidders from less qualified bidders. It helps you define which bidder is good, better, and best. So how do we incorporate desirables? You're going to want to allocate more points to those must-have desirables that you just can't live without, and allocate less points to those maybe desirables that you can live without. A small weight is not going to drive the decision. So your evaluation instructions should guide the experienced and inexperienced evaluator to have the same level of understanding regarding what the agency need is, explain what to look for to support each baby criteria, and how to score each baby criteria. So if you have a maybe or optional desired criteria item, as mentioned, when you allocate less points, it's not going to drive the evaluation decision. All vendors must include their solution to that maybe desirable to be deemed responsive. Now, if there is a small, tiny remote chance that you're going to use that maybe desirable, then that maybe desirable must be evaluated. Okay, we have another question. The question is, multi-award contracts requiring call-down lists or ranked vendors can be challenging. Hannah, can you address multiple awards on a bid?
So how do we conduct multi-award procurements? Well, in multi-award procurements, the agency should detail how many contracts will be awarded, whether it's up to 3, whether it's contracts to the top 2 scorers, or to all responsive and responsible vendors. As a best practice, the agency should also include justification in the procurement record for the necessity of the multi-award, or why multiple vendors are needed for the services, and any benefits of using this procurement method. The agency should also explain how work will be divided between vendors. Contracts could be awarded by lot or by region. It's up to agency discretion to decide how to distribute work, but this should be explained. In some instances, you may have a primary or a secondary vendor. In this case, the procurement should clearly indicate the conditions required to move to the second vendor. Call-down lists are encouraged and typically used for best price procurements. The vendors are ranked first by price and then by availability. An alternative structure of a multi-award could allow agencies to conduct a mini-bid among all vendors on the backdrop contracts at not to exceed rates bid in the RFP. Finally, the agency has to establish contract values. Contract values can be proportionate based off of ranking, such as the primary vendor receiving a $1 million contract and the secondary vendor receiving $500,000, because you'd expect to use the primary vendor much more. Alternatively, backdrop contracts requiring mini bids among vendors could start at a $0 value, with contract ceiling increases based on actual scopes of work awarded. So our next question is, how can we keep up with current technologies when changes happen almost monthly and the procurement process can take about 2 years? We find what we need or what we could obtain when we wrote the procurement is almost out of date or behind the curve when we finish the product. Jen, advice on keeping up with current technologies?
Thanks, Hannah. This is a really great question about current technologies and how fast they change. So what's new this year could be outdated next year, just like your cell phone. But what doesn't change is your agency need. So ask yourself, how well does this proposal solve my problem? Then let's drill down to the specifics. Is this technology new to your agency, or is your agency already knowledgeable of this technology? So let's say it's a completely new technology. So what I'm going to recommend is advertise an RFI or request for information. Tap into that vendor pool and get advice from the market experts. Do a knowledge share for a current solution and possible future needs. It really is a win-win introduction, both for the vendor and to the agency, because it allows vendors to introduce their ideas and their suggestions. But it's up to you, the agency, to sort out which suggestion works best for you and your agency. We will talk further about RFI pitfalls later in the solicitation of interest section. So if you are familiar with the technology, then it's easy to make changes. So reach out to your program department and get constant updates. Also, a best practice to keep your program process on track, we recommend set up a reasonable timeline for various milestones. In other words, ask yourself these timeline questions. Is the advertisement accurate? Does the scope detail your must-have desirables and your maybe desirables? Do you have all the required clauses? Do you have debriefing and protest language included in your solicitation? Does the evaluation instrument and criteria weights mirror the RFP? Are funds encumbered? And are you ready in case a debriefing is requested? A lot of detail and transparency is best for both the bidder and the agency. So we have another question that's come up. What guidance can you share with us on building expertise in procuring IT products and services? So Hannah, can you guide us on procuring IT products and services?
Sure. Well, regarding building expertise in procuring IT products and services, when agencies would benefit from obtaining more information from vendors that's not available through program area research, agencies should consider releasing a request for information, or RFI, to gather information. Agencies can use this to avoid restrictive requirements and also to gain insight into industry standards, including cost structure, and develop a quality procurement.
That's a lot of great information, Hannah. Thank you. We have another question. Can you walk us through the steps of procuring maintenance for long-term IT products? Like how to procure maintenance for long-term IT products. So, Hannah, what do you think about this question?
Well, executive agencies should defer to ITS as applicable for technology procurements in order to facilitate long-term planning of IT assets and ensure the most cost-effective long-term solution is obtained. Make sure you get your ITS plan to procure approval early on in your procurement process. If the agency expects to need a contract term over 5 years to include maintenance and support for the system, the agency could advertise for a longer-term contract as long as the agency reaches out to OSC first for prior approval before advertising. Make sure you reach out to OSC and explain why you need a longer contract term and any benefits of the longer contract term. For software requiring ongoing maintenance and support, services should be procured competitively when possible. We understand that this isn't always possible, but in some instances, vendors may have authorized resellers for their proprietary products, and they may be able to provide maintenance. And Jenny, this is our final answer. This is our final question regarding method of award. How should we approach cloud-based software and software implementation services due to the additional risks and novel requirements presented by this newer technology? Jenny, could you share your approach to cloud-based software?
Thanks, Hannah. Cloud-based software, definitely a newer technology. So I do want to touch on 3 items to consider when implementing a cloud solution and how we can mitigate the risks. So the question you want to ask yourself is the cloud a multi-tenant platform? So what that means is, will multiple people be using the same server? And if you're sharing the platform, who can get my data? Is it possible? Another question, if you're sharing hardware, software, or network, if there is sharing, the preferred sharing is with other government entities, is most optimal than sharing with private sector entities. So the first item to talk about with cloud-based software, I recommend do a competitive market analysis before starting a new contract or well before any renewal period. Perform your agency due diligence on different cloud providers. Their solution varies and the cost could vary too. Another item, to mitigate potential risks not identified in the cloud contract. So you want to ask yourself, could there be some hidden and incremental costs that I just don't see? Now, cloud contracts, generally, they're really short contracts written by the provider, so they favor the provider. And they may even include live links for pricing. It could be that the terms and conditions outside the main contract are mentioned, but not included. So there is a cost risk involved. The vendor can change pricing, escalation, and renewals at any time. So the state really should address any vague terms not identified in the main contract. Another item, are the setup costs bundled together or separated out? Because there could be database install, software install, preliminary configuration, conceptual design, process flows, data import planning, and workflow setup. But what about maintenance and support? Is that bundled in one monthly fee? Or is maintenance and support an additional charge above the monthly fee? So bottom line about monthly fees, don't be swayed by you see that low monthly fee, because there could be some hidden costs that could change that intended best value procurement into a really not very best value procurement. So the third item that I want to touch on is negotiate. Revisit your agency needs to mitigate the risk. We know that Appendix A should take precedence. So we recommend in that provider contract, make sure that the order precedence is clearly defined. Strike out any auto renewal provision because renewals and escalation must be defined. Ensure proper security measures are identified and clarify what happens if there's a breach of information. Clarify downtime expectations and confirm sensitive information stays within the continental U.S. If you're unsure of what risks are acceptable, please consult your legal department and please include any appropriate documentation on their determination and summarize the steps taken in that cover letter to OSC. Okay, so let's move over to the evaluation. So our next topic that we're going to discuss, and our first question in the evaluation is, how do we set up the evaluation and scoring for an RFP? Hannah, can you help us out with evaluation and scoring in an RFP?
Well, in RFPs, best practice is to develop evaluation tools when you're writing your specifications. Agencies typically weigh the technical and cost evaluations at 70% technical and 30% cost. However, costs can be weighted higher. When you submit your procurement record, you should be prepared to explain why you weighted it that way. It can be helpful to consider how you're going to evaluate your desired criteria as you're writing the RFP, so you can make sure you're asking the right questions to help you find the best vendor, and that you're asking for information in a way you can evaluate it. For a team of consultants, you might want to know specific experience for a few key staff members, but maybe receiving 20 or 30 resumes for an entire consulting team isn't necessary. At least one program area expert should be involved in drafting evaluation criteria. Evaluation instruments should detail the agency's process for conducting technical and cost evaluations and establish points allocated to specific criteria and to subcriteria. Also, be sure to include instructions to evaluators to guide scoring criteria. This will lead to more consistent scoring, which will help with the procurement moving faster, both through the evaluation process and through our review, and we all want that. With clear instructions, evaluators understand what's expected of them, leaving less open to interpretation. Another thing we like to see, we love evaluator comments. We want to know how the evaluators decided a proposal exceeded expectations or completely missed the mark. Procurement Council guidelines contain more detailed instructions about information to be included in the evaluation document. Finally, please allow space for evaluator comments on individual evaluator score sheets and verify that evaluators have provided comments to explain high or low scores for each criteria. Our next question is, how do we create appropriate evaluation criteria or scoring tools when doing a multi-step evaluation where top scoring vendors move on to a finalist round? Jenny, can you shed some light on the multi-step evaluation process?
Thanks, Hannah. Sure, I'd like to do that. So we know that there's going to be 3 basic evaluations: the administrative, technical, and cost. But then we also can throw in another one, which we're going to discuss in a moment, shortlisting. So let's go back from the beginning. Administrative evaluation, that's going to review your mandatory requirements. Those are your pass-fails. Your technical evaluation are your desirables. Now, this is not a comparison scoring to other proposals because you're only going to be scoring on the information in front of you just for that one vendor. So you want to make sure you develop evaluation instructions, score sheets with comment section. Your evaluation instructions to evaluators should be detailed because each evaluator has different levels of expertise, and we want all evaluators to know what is expected of them. This helps avoid inconsistent scoring. Your evaluation instructions should outline to the evaluators what to look for each baby criteria item. Now, your cost evaluation. This is a comparison scoring of all cost proposals received. That's why the lowest cost bidder gets awarded full cost points. So shortlisting. Shortlisting is that composite score of both technical and cost points. It's really not necessary if the bidder pool is small, but we highly recommend it if you anticipate a lot of bids. It could be a time saver, especially if you're short-staffed with a high workload, because you really want to just interview the best of the best, and you may not want to spend time interviewing a bidder if they're not susceptible to award. Shortlisting, you have to invite everyone who is susceptible to award. The shortlisting parameters must be identified in the RFP. And please be very transparent and specific. For example, maybe shortlisting is going to be limited to the top 5 composite scores. You also want to identify if interviews are for clarification only or points will be awarded. So I'm just going to chat a little bit about a couple pitfalls regarding shortlisting. Pitfall 1, shortlisting parameters and the RFP are not clearly identified. If the RFP states shortlisting is for the top 2 composite scores and the next cluster. So the question you want to ask yourself is, what is the definition of a cluster as it relates to points? Is this transparent? Is the agency's intention clearly understood by all bidders? If the use of the term cluster isn't transparent, could this become susceptible to a debriefing and possibly a protest? Pitfall number 2, regarding use of minimum technical scores for shortlisting. So, is this really a shortlisting within the shortlisting if you're adding in minimum technical scores? Is this necessary? And could you be limiting your bidder pool a little bit too much So we have another question that's come up. The question is, what alternatives to minimum technical scores would OSC recommend to avoid awarding contracts to unqualified, low-cost proposals unable to meet the agency's needs? So Hannah, can you help us out how to avoid unqualified bidders?
Sure. So how can you avoid getting stuck with an unqualified vendor? Generally, if a vendor meets mandatory or minimum qualifications established by the agency and the agency's program area, they should be capable of providing the scope of work. Things such as particular level of experience with a specific software, having a particular license, or an ability to demonstrate they've worked on a similarly sized scope are examples of qualifications that an agency could require. Just be careful that the minimum qualifications aren't too restrictive. OSC recommends considering the importance of a particular desired criteria and weighting the technical score accordingly. Maybe instead of having each desired criteria worth 4 or 5 points, have some worth significantly more points and others much lower. Focus on what's most important and think about the potential impact to services if the desired criteria isn't met. Also, think about how much more valuable it is to have a vendor that exceeds expectations for a particular desired criteria, and whether you'd be willing to accept a vendor that partially meets other desired criteria if they're exceptional for that particular criteria. Maybe if you're looking for investment services, years of experience in some key staff isn't as important as historical performance. Or maybe it's more important. Your program area should let you know what they need most. The agency may also use references to validate that its criteria as outlined in their technical proposal. Another option to ensure the agency's confidence that the vendor is qualified for the scope of work may be scoring interviews as part of the vendor's technical score. If interviews could result in changes in scores, this should be clear in both the RFP and the evaluation instrument. And our last question regarding evaluation today is, what are pitfalls to avoid in setting up pricing sheets and selection criteria? Jenny, could you share your tips for avoiding pitfalls on pricing sheets?
Thanks, Hannah. Pitfalls on pricing sheets. So let's take a look at pitfall number 1, job titles. So personally for me, when I started with the state, I started out as a purchasing officer. Then I became a purchasing agent, and now I'm a contract management specialist. Different job title, same job description. So now this could be the same issue when it comes within the vendor community. Different vendors use different job title names. However, their duties remain the same. So what happens if the agency job title may not be an exact match to a vendor's job title? How do we get past this? So what I recommend, within the RFP, provide an agency definition of each agency job title. Include the requirements, the expectations, and maybe the years of experience required. Put the onus on the bidder. The bidder must match their unique job title to your agency's standard job title. Please be very clear, the vendor has to follow your job title descriptions and actual job titles, and identify that all vendor invoicing must continue to match the agency job titles. So pitfall number 2 that I want to talk about are no estimated hours in the cost proposal. So the issue here is letting the vendor or propose their own number of hours because they are the experts in their solution for your agency scope. The problem is it's not an apples to apples comparison, and the state could end up losing money. The bidder could intentionally lowball their estimated hours just to get the most cost points as possible, which really is not a realistic score. So, and their invoicing, when submitted, will be based on actual hours, which results in the state paying more than the original bid price, which really is not best value. So what we recommend, the agency should include estimated hours for each job title. Make it that apples to apples comparison. So if you want a full-time employee, identify. You want 2,080 hours is a full-time employee. And use that historical precedence, actual usage of a prior contract, and do a tally of hours from past invoices for your cost proposal. You could also, another option is, you could do a cost proposal with one flat rate. The vendor can provide an all-inclusive price for everything. There'll be no amendment allowed to increase the contract value. There'll be no cost increase allowed. So the onus is on vendor. If they do end up using more hours, the flat rate is what they get paid. It will not change. So let's talk about pitfall number 3, one lump score. So the issue is the evaluator score sheet identifies one criteria score needed, and all associated baby criteria fall under that one overall parent criteria score. So what we recommend is, because each evaluator has a different strength and level of understanding, there is a possibility more attention will be given to one baby criteria and another baby criteria might be ignored completely. Since each baby criteria is important enough to be identified in the evaluation, then each baby criteria should stand alone and be evaluated individually and independently. This will ensure each baby criteria is evaluated on a level playing field. So what we recommend, what if your technical evaluation doesn't have a lot of criteria items, but you still want an accurate technical scoring from the evaluators? So in this example, imagine the RFP is identified as a 70-30, 70 technical, 30 costs, which is 100 maximum available points. And this technical evaluation only includes 3 baby criteria items. So in this case, let's give each baby criteria a tight scoring range, 1 to 3. 1 point doesn't meet. 2 point meets. 3 points exceeds. On the surface, it looks like the top score is going to be maximum 3 points times 3 baby criteria only equals 9 points. And this does not add up to 70 points. So let's do some creative math together. Let's make it add up to 70 points. We talked about each baby criteria gets weighed on how important it is to your agency. So in this example, the first baby criteria score, let's give it a 50% weight. That's going to be 50 maximum available points because it's that must-have criteria and is very important to your agency. Now, the second baby criteria, let's weigh it at 19%. It's medium important to your agency. And that third baby criteria, 1%. It's that optional maybe criteria, and it's not very important. So 50 plus 19 plus 1 is still going to make 70. But the result is that must-have baby criteria was weighed more because it's very important to you. And that maybe baby criteria weighed less because it was part of the evaluation and it did not sway the evaluation, but you can use it because it was part of the evaluation. Okay, so we have another topic.
Thank you, Jenny. We actually have one question that came in. If we use estimated hours, is the final contract limited to the total dollars from the estimate, or can the agency set a cap? For example, the estimate came to 100,000 and the agency wants to put the top limit at 250,000. Can this be done only paying for items requested? When a transaction comes in, we generally want to see at OSC that the amount that was evaluated is somewhat representative of the transaction amount or the final contract value. It's certainly reasonable for an agency to account for potentially higher than anticipated spend, or you may need more than you anticipate when it first comes in. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we see a transaction value that, say, doubles the amount of the evaluation amount, there's usually concern that we would question were the estimated quantities actually calculated appropriately. So that's something you want to think about when it comes in. We're okay with a buffer, depending on how that's calculated, but we normally want to see your math when that specific item comes in. So we just wanted to point that out specifically. Now we're going to turn this over to Liz, who's going to talk about discretionary procurements.
Thank you, Dave. Liz and I are actually both going to handle this one. And first of all, thank you, Jenny and Hannah, for that excellent information. So we received several questions asking us about discretionary purchases under $50,000 and how they differ from discretionary purchases under $500,000. Again, Liz and I will go into more in depth into what these types of purchases are and the unique nuances between the two. Liz, would you like to start us off by telling us a little bit about discretionary purchases under $50,000?
Thanks, Steve. First, let's take a high-level overview about what is the discretionary buying threshold. So the discretionary buying threshold for commodities, services, and technology not available from preferred sources or from the OGS centralized contracts is $50,000 for state agencies. This means purchases up to the discretionary buying threshold are not subject to the formal competitive requirements set forth in State Finance Law 163. For discretionary purchases, however, agencies must still adhere to advertising requirements set forth in Economic Development Law, Article 4C, and the agency's internal policies and procedures. There should be a supported reason for why the agency selected this vendor for this opportunity. State Finance Law Section 112 defines OSC prior approval thresholds for contracts entered into by state agencies as over $50,000. Now, if it is anticipated that this will be an ongoing commodities purchase or service agreement where the agreement may exceed the threshold at any time, OSC recommends a formal competitive process subject to OSC's approval. In cases where the agreement will not exceed $50,000 over the entire term, OSC still recommends implementing best practices of soliciting 3 or more quotes to ensure the state is getting the best pricing. Moving on to discretionary purchases under $500,000, Steve, can you discuss what an agency might do for discretionary purchases under $500,000?
Absolutely. Thank you, Liz. So to encourage the use of New York State businesses, New York State Executive Law Article 15A and 14B permit state agencies and authorities to purchase goods or services under $500,000 exclusively from disenfranchised businesses in New York, more specifically New York State minority or women-owned businesses, known as MWBEs, service-disabled veteran-owned businesses, known as SDVOBs, and small business enterprises. Much like any other contract over $50,000, an agency is still required to advertise this procurement opportunity, submit a contract to OSC for review and approval, and perform standard procurement practices like conducting vendor responsibility reviews and providing cost justification. The main difference here is that an agency can limit their procurement to specifically MWBEs, SDVOBs, or small businesses, so long as the agency has identified that a contracting opportunity exists within one or more of these groups and ensures that the transaction will remain under $500,000 for the full contract term. While an agency may award a contract to whichever responsive and responsible vendor they choose for these kinds of procurements, they must document why a particular vendor was selected for award, how much the contract total will be for, and how the vendor was deemed responsive, including proof of their certification under their respective titles. This last detail is incredibly important. Please be aware that for these types of procurements, a vendor must be certified in New York State as either an MWBE, SDVOB, and/or small business in order to receive an award. Vendors should provide proof of their certification in their bids, but it is also a best practice to check the online directories available for MWBEs and SDVOBs to ensure that a vendor certification is still valid and current. These directories are available on the OGS website and can also be useful when creating a solicitation list for future procurements. There is not currently a New York State small business directory available, so supporting documentation from the vendor that demonstrates their compliance as a New York State small business must be provided. One final note, is that the $500,000 maximum for these types of procurements is only applicable as of contracts advertised on or after January 2020. For any contracts advertised prior to this date, the discretionary purchasing cap is set at $200,000.
Thank you, Stephen. We're receiving a lot of questions regarding the scoring of MWBEs and SBOBs. Randy, can you talk about some of our general guidance that we provide when we receive these questions?
So one of the first things we recommend is checking out the Department of Economic Development's website. But specifically when evaluating diversity practices in a best value situation, Economic Development recommends not going more than 10% of the total technical score to be evaluated within the diversity practices. So if you were doing a 60-40 technical split, that would give 6 points towards the diversity practices that the particular contractor is articulating in their proposal. So we would also recommend that look at that economic development website to help guide creating your solicitation.
Thank you, Randy. Next, we're going to move on to a favorite topic that we received several questions on regarding the solicitation of interest process. I'll hand this off to Liz.
Thanks, Dave. So prior to this presentation, and also we received a few questions in the chat today, solicitation of interests or SOIs. Jenny, during the 2019 fall conference, it was said that an SOI could be used for support of a source justification. What's the difference between an SOI and an RFI or a request for information? And what does OSC consider to be the benefits of conducting an SOI?
Thanks, Elizabeth. So SOI or RFI, which should we use and what are they and how to use them? So these are really great questions, but let's look at this from the beginning. Which one should we do, SOI or RFI? So let's do a comparison. Now an RFI or request for information is a fact-finding research because you're unfamiliar with that good or services. You do need to advertise the RFI and you want to assemble a panel of experts from the vendor community. Utilize their expertise. So the reasons why we want to do this, maybe we're unsure of the job titles are needed because this is a completely unfamiliar good or service. Maybe we're unsure about the number of hours that will be needed to meet our need. Perhaps you're unsure what a reasonable hourly rate would be. Make this into a group effort regarding the vendor community experts and yourself. This is going to help you with writing your procurement specifications. But there is a pitfall I just want to mention. When you're assembling the whole group of experts, don't take all your information from just one vendor. This could result in that one vendor writing your specifications, and that could unfairly advantage that just one vendor. So here's an example. Maybe the bidder you could have listed as a bidder's main office must be 50 miles away from the agency. So let's say vendor A is 50 miles away, so he meets your mandatory requirements. Now, if vendor A wrote the specifications to unfairly advantage themselves, you're reducing your bidding pool and making it just smaller because he knows that vendor B's main office is 60 miles away. So he knows vendor B does not meet the mandatory requirements. So what I'm recommending is do your due diligence to avoid this pitfall. Do your own research to get the biggest pool of vendors possible. And perhaps an alternative, you may require the bidder must be able to respond within 1 hour. So that's an RFI, doing that fact-finding research. But an SOI is a solicitation of interest. Now this is an informal procurement process and it's a great tool to have in your toolbox if you're trying to verify a single source. An SOI does not automatically lead to a contract because it is dependent on the results of your advertisement of that solicitation of interest. So if you're struggling to document why this is a single source, you're going to want to utilize the SOI because it's going to help you demonstrate and generate evidence to support that single source determination. It helps you demonstrate that this is the only choice you have. So you do need to advertise the SOI because you want to confirm if there are any vendors interested in your solicitation. So your SOI steps to take, you want a level playing field that doesn't favor one vendor above another vendor. So do that agency web search. Look for those vendors. Try and make the biggest pool possible. Because you do want to support that single source contract reporter exemption request. And you want to show that you did your due diligence as an agency. Because if you combine your agency research with a solicitation of interest, that supports your single source procurement if you only get one response. But let's say you get 2 responses from that advertised SOI. Hey, you get to do a formal RFP. So that's how a solicitation of interest and an RFI differ and how they'll benefit your agency.
Thanks, Jenny. What about how do we get OSC to say yes to our sole source? Can you please provide us some ideas on how to submit and secure approval for a sole source procurement?
Thanks, Liz. So sole source procurements are very rare. That's pretty much saying no one else can do the service. Now, that's possible with some technology procurements because possibly there is only one vendor that has the source code. Or maybe a warranty could be voided if it's performed by someone else. Maybe there are no resellers for that needed service. But generally, someone is out there that can do it. However, let's take a look at the alternatives. If you can demonstrate there are no viable alternatives, that your vendor is head and shoulders better than anyone else, only this one vendor can do it and nobody else, if that's true, then show us the research you did. We still recommend to advertise that solicitation of interest. Perhaps you could call other agencies to see if they have a similar need, and if so, tell us about your call. And include your due diligence steps within that cover letter to OSC. Explain to us what steps you took for your search for an alternative vendor. So there's one pitfall I do want to mention, and it's most difficult to confirm as a sole source vendor, is when your vendor provides a letter statement attesting they're a sole source vendor. So you want to ask yourself, does this vendor attesting that they're sole source, is this enough verification? Could this attestation be a little biased? And what is the state's best interest? Unfortunately, the vendor's letter statement saying that they're a sole source vendor is insufficient justification because it does lead to more questions that need answers. Maybe there are other authorized resellers. Maybe there are similar products or services out there. And it also asks, how was price reasonableness confirmed? So you, as the agency, want to explain why a competitive procurement isn't possible and provide your due diligence steps taken to support why your agency determined this sole source justification.
Thank you, Jenny. Before we go to the next topic, we do have a question.
Hi, Lisa is asking if we recommend having a question and answer period inside of a solicitation of interest. Dave, what do you think about that?
It's a good question, Randy. I think the intent is if you are going to do a question and answer period for an SOI process, it should mirror the best practice and requirement that you would follow for an IFB or an RFP, where if questions were received by one vendor, the agency or campus or authority should answer that question and distribute those answers to everyone. I think the intent of an SOI, remember, is just to determine if there's interest in a procurement opportunity. It is not intended to replicate a formal competitive process that you would utilize for an IFB or an RFP. Remember, another way to determine if your specs are reasonable or unreasonable, perhaps instead of an SOI, is maybe use the request for information process via the contract reporter to ask for input from the vendor community about what you're planning to do. That's just another idea to consider if you're not really sure about what you're going to procure. All right, so we're going to move on to our next section. Thank you for that question. Jenny?
That was a lot of great information. Thank you so much, Dave. Now we do have a next topic that we're going to discuss is price reasonableness with Liz.
All right, so I think we received a question on what are some acceptable price reasonableness justifications in case the agency has a single or sole source or an IFB or RFP with only one response. And that does come up often, and I just want to start out by saying that price reasonableness justification is required anytime the agency received less than 3 bids in response to a contracting opportunity. We at OSC understand there are circumstances where competition is limited, so we have identified a list of ways to justify cost. Acceptable price justifications may include a solicited quote effort with at least 3 or more quotes. Did your agency perform due diligence in contacting other potential providers for pricing? If the selected vendor can provide goods or services at a lower cost than the competition, this is a good example of price reasonableness justification. Cost versus benefit in monetary terms.
What are acceptable price reasonableness justifications in case of a single or sole source or an IFB or RFP with only one response?
Now, starting with price reasonableness justification. Now, I want to say that it is required anytime the agency received less than 3 bids in response to a contracting opportunity. Now, we at OSC understand there are circumstances where competition is limited, so we have identified a list of ways to justify cost. Acceptable price justifications may include a solicited quote effort with at least 3 or more quotes. Did the agency perform due diligence in contacting other potential providers for pricing? If the selected vendor can provide goods or services at a lower cost than the competition, this is a good example of price reasonableness justification. Cost versus benefit in monetary terms. What are the benefits of contracting with this vendor minus the costs associated? Do the benefits negate a good portion of the costs? Purchases by other state agencies. Do other state agencies have similar contracts to this one in which the same vendor was used? Is the pricing under this contract the same or less? Purchases made by similar facilities. Did your agency do a search on Open Book for contracts this vendor has with similar facilities for similar purchases? Discount from price lists. Historical cost. Has the historical cost of this vendor's pricing relatively stayed the same or only increased by a small percentage? The manufacturer's published price list. Is there a published price list for this manufacturer, and are they giving the state a discount on the pricing they have published? Manufacturing costs plus profit. Does the vendor have only a slight profit margin? Do other vendors have a higher markup for similar services? Can also provide the cost comparisons of similar projects, average wage prices or similar average costs in a region, or used as a last resort if no other documentation can be offered, a statement from the vendor documenting that such charges to the state are better, equal to, or lower than that charged to other government agencies.
That's a lot of great information. Thanks so much, Liz. We have another question that came up. Contract negotiation best practices or techniques that can help create a smoother process. It can be especially difficult to negotiate with a company that's new to New York State procurement and contracts. Are there any tips and tricks that will streamline the process? They will be greatly appreciated. Liz, can you help the agency with some tips and tricks in streamlining the process?
Yes, thanks, Jenny. So OSC recommends a direct approach for cost negotiations. If the winning bidder's prices are exorbitant compared to other pricing offered in the market, point that out to the vendor and provide your comparisons. Agencies can also use the numerous ways noted before as price justification examples as leverage to negotiate lower costs in order to ensure that New York State receives the best rate available. Feel free to throw OSC into the mix. Tell the vendor OSC is going to question your agency on pricing. Lastly, request invoices or prices charged to other government entities to compare the rates New York State is receiving to those others have received to ensure we are getting the best rates available. That concludes our price reasonableness section, and now we will move on to best practices, starting out with Steve. We have a question for you here on contract negotiations. Can New York State negotiate the legal terms and conditions with the vendors if the vendors' terms conflict with the state's?
Excellent question. Thank you, Liz. So does New York State have wiggle room when it comes to legal terms between the vendor's terms and our own? And the short answer is yes, but there are some considerations we need to account for and document in the procurement record when such instances occur. For one, it is important to remember that the terms and conditions found in the standard clauses for New York State contracts document, better known as New York State's Appendix A, have been developed over time as responses to situations in which New York State may not have been adequately protected in past procurements. As such, it is absolutely necessary to ensure that this document is included in all state procurements, either by reference or by including the physical document in each agency procurement. Now, if there's ever a case when a winning vendor's terms and conditions conflict with those of the states, efforts should first be made to have the vendor formally remove or modify their own terms from the agreement before a contract is finalized. If a vendor is unwilling or unable to remove their terms, but does not require the state to change any of its own, it may be possible to include both parties' terms and conditions into the contract by way of a C prefix contract with Appendix A taking precedence. However, we recommend consulting your agency's own legal counsel or the Attorney General's office for guidance in such instances, as these are all handled on a case-by-case basis. Similarly, if a vendor will not modify their terms and instead requires the state to omit or change its own terms, we would again recommend the agency consult with its legal counsel for guidance before finalizing the contract with this vendor. If a legal opinion is that the removal or modification of any part of Appendix A is acceptable, the agency must sufficiently justify and document for the record why an exception is being made and why it is okay for the state to take on this additional risk.
Thanks, Steve. We have another question about ensuring vendors can fulfill the needs of a contract. So what does an agency do if a vendor is no longer able to provide the goods and services after the contract is approved?
Another great question. Thank you. Well, there's actually some information relating to this in the Procurement Council guidelines under the section detailing the New York State's reserved rights. The reserved rights provide the state with additional protections, and we recommend including these in all state procurements. One of these reserved rights that relates to this question is that a vendor's bid must be firm and irrevocable for a minimum of 60 days, though an agency can always extend this time frame in the procurement if necessary. OSC also recommends including additional references to this time frame throughout the procurement to further ensure that this information is clear and understood by the vendor. If, however, a vendor is ultimately unable to fulfill the contract, state agencies can then opt to exercise other reserved rights, such as the right to not make an award, the right to make a partial award, or the right to select the runner-up winner to complete the contract, whichever the agency finds to be the most appropriate course of action. However an agency chooses to address this, please ensure that there is clear documentation in the procurement record of why the respective decision was made. If all else fails, an agency may also wish to consider a CRER for a short-term exemption while a new procurement is developed. However, please be aware that this is a last resort and must only be for the minimum amount of time necessary to ameliorate the contract circumstance and not an alternative to the competitive bidding process. Ultimately, everything is case by case in these situations. The vendor should all understand that by submitting their bid or signing the contract, that they are agreeing to all the requirements of the procurement, including how long their bids must remain valid for. We understand things happen though, so it is important to know that there are alternative options available to the state to make sure each agency is able to fulfill its need.
Thanks, Steve. So emergencies come up sometimes that the agency can't prepare for. What is the best process to handle an emergency procurement that will require OSC approval?
Thank you. So in the case of a true emergency, we recommend calling OSC to explain the situation. Depending on the nature of the emergency, OSC may be able to give verbal authorization over the phone for an abbreviated procurement process to address the immediate need with a procurement record to follow. As is especially important with time-sensitive contracts, emergency or otherwise, please ensure your agency provides as much information in the cover letter and procurement record as possible to maintain transparency. This should include, but is not limited to, the nature of the emergency, if applicable, all noteworthy information relating to the procurement, such as if there's any debriefings or protests, and any pressing timeframes or relevant dates which may affect the efficacy of the contract. Emergency scenarios are treated seriously at OSC, so if your agency does experience a scenario like this, please call us as soon as possible. I know Randy previously provided his phone number early in the presentation, but I wanted to reiterate it here in case you needed to get in touch with us for an emergency. His number is 518-486-1250.
Thanks, Steve. We have another question for you regarding banking contracts. Could you please provide us some more guidance on how to conduct a banking services contract?
So, what are some ways to conduct banking services contracts? Well, firstly, banking services can vary greatly among agencies, and the means to conduct the procurement for the service is entirely dependent on each agency's particular need. But we would first recommend contacting SFS to see if the statewide financial system can provide the function that your agency is looking for. SFS is always evolving to incorporate additional functionality and services, and can currently receive payments, make payments, handle invoicing, as well as many other functions that you may need. Again, please check with SFS first to see if they can accommodate your need, thereby fulfilling your form, function, and utility without having to go out to bid. If SFS is unable to meet the function required, go back to the program area for assistance. Work closely with them to develop and refine what the particular banking needs for your agency are. Since the agency's need will ultimately be the scope of work for the procurement, reconnect with the program area to learn what business problems they need a contractor to solve and how they imagine interacting with the banking industry. Once you have a clear picture of the need, you can then begin to learn if these services or products are currently available by banking institutions, which can serve as the beginning of your bidders list. Once an agency's requirements have been defined, you can begin developing specifications and an evaluation instrument to measure which proposals would best meet the agency's need. An additional resource which can be of help with any contract, banking services or otherwise, is Open Book New York. Agency staff can use this website to identify other agencies that have done similar contracts to the one they're working on, and creates an opportunity for outreach between agencies to exchange ideas, seek guidance, and receive recommendations of what to include when drafting your own procurements.
Okay, it looks like we have a question that's come up. Sometimes we have demands for prior bid information when the question and answer period has expired and before the bid opening. So we don't answer the question. My question is, should we answer a late question? So this is really a very interesting question because it involves so many layers. So the bidder missed the Q&A period opportunity, and the bid opening hasn't happened yet. Therefore, no award to any winner has been made yet. So if you think responding will benefit your agency, then you can say yes. Then I recommend responding to that late question. So let's say the question was for prior contract hourly rates. Could you respond giving your agency a chance at a more competitive or lower hourly rate? Now, the vendor's objective is to make as much money as possible. They're going to want to bid the highest rate they think that you're going to accept. However, the agency goal is to get best value for their procurement because they want the most qualified vendor at the lowest hourly rate. So it's like a balancing act. So you at the agency need to decide if you answer that late question and if you're going to provide that prior hourly rate. If you do decide you're going to do it, you should answer all late questions and issue an addendum to be transparent to all bidders and to be fair and answer all the late questions.
Thanks, Jenny. Agency asks, how long should our agency allow for a debriefing period? Jenny, could you provide guidance about debriefings?
Thanks, Hannah. Now, a debriefing period. We want to make sure the best practice is to be transparent. So generally, debriefings should show up twice, in the RFP or IFP, and also in the non-award notification. Now, State Finance Law 163 says that a minimum of 15 calendar days from the non-award notice that you allow for a debriefing period. However, it's up to you, the agency, to choose. You can go longer than 15 days, but you must wait until the debriefing period is over. Then you can submit your contract for approval to OSC. So I just want to mention a pitfall. During the debriefing, we don't recommend discussing other bids during that debriefing. You really should only discuss their non-winning bid with that non-winning vendor. And we don't recommend telling them where they fell short to the standard. It's, they're kind of probably feeling a little bit sensitive right now. So stay away from saying the winner is better because of XYZ reasons. They could be, like I said, they could be feeling a little bit sensitive right now. What we do recommend is, let's help them out. Do explain that evaluations are based on how well their bid was able to articulate their experience and service to meet your agency's needs. And do tell them where they fell short in their proposal. Do suggest how to improve their bid for next time. And what to submit to OSC after the debriefing? Please include the debriefing document because it is part of the procurement record. And that document should list who the vendor was, when it occurred, and what was discussed. Now, even if the debriefing was just a phone call, submit the notes taken because, like I said, it is part of the procurement record. And include a summary within your cover letter. Identify the total number of debriefings that were requested for your solicitation and explain if a debriefing turned into an agency-level protest.
Thank you, Jenny. Our next question is regarding bid protests. Bid protests are always the most difficult for our agency. What should we do to reduce the chance of a protest? What are your tips for reducing chances of a protest, Jenny?
Protests. Okay. It's always a difficult hurdle to get past. So we want to reduce the chance of a protest during a debriefing. So like I mentioned, be helpful. Show them where they fell short and teach them where their bid fell short and advise them how to improve their next bid and be positive. Teach them how to better articulate their services to meet the agency needs and recommend. What we recommend is think of the debriefing as your last chance to make a good impression with that non-winning vendor. So the question was about protests. So the first protest level is at the agency level. So please, within your submission, provide all vendor correspondence regarding the protest and include it within the submission packet. Provide all documented legal determinations and a summary in that cover letter, and let us know if that protest was resolved. Now, there is a second level protest, and here is just some things I want to suggest to hopefully avoid a protest directly to OSC. For clarity and transparency, build the protest language right into your boilerplate. As much as possible, make the solicitation as transparent as possible. Document your procurement process, and if it is a phone call that you receive, follow it up with an email to reiterate what was discussed. The clear, complete, and transparent solicitation process leaves less wiggle room for a protest.
Steve, I have a question for you regarding my favorite OSC application, the electronic document submission system. How should an agent submit materials into EDSS?
Excellent question. Thank you, Liz. Yes, we love receiving questions about EDSS. For those of you who may not be familiar with this topic, the Electronic Document Submission System, better known as EDSS, is an application available to state agencies for uploading contracts and all of their associated procurement record documents directly and securely to OSC for review and approval. EDSS has several drop-downs for identifying the types of documents being provided to help maintain a clear and organized procurement record, and allows several document file types to be attached to the electronic submission. EDSS currently supports uploading of new grant procurements, contract reporter exemption requests, and procurement contracts awarded by best price or best value, as well as any amendments to these transactions. EDSS has also greatly increased the speed by which contract documents can be sent to OSC, since there is no shipping or receiving, and it has reduced the time it takes for OSC's notice of approval or non-approval to reach state agencies by way of its integrated notification system. This system informs users of any updates to the procurement record in real time and sends notifications directly to the user's emails for their record and reference. EDSS has been crucial during the current health crisis and has quickly proven itself to be an essential tool for OSC's contract approval process. We hope agencies are also seeing the value the system has provided to your program area customers as well, since EDSS represents the future of OSC's contract approval. Now, when it comes to submitting materials in EDSS, OSC has created a guide which outlines the order in which documents should be provided for new contracts and amendments. This guide also identifies how documents should be labeled and organized, and goes into greater detail of what documents are required for each type of transaction. This guide is available for download from the OSC website and can be found by typing Submission Guide into the search bar. We recommend using this document when organizing procurements for upload to EDSS, and if you have any questions about how to use it or any difficulties locating it, please feel free to contact OSC for assistance.
All right, we have one last question, and it is also regarding EDSS. Do agencies need to print, sign, and scan documents before uploading them into EDSS, or is there another option available to upload signed documents?
Another excellent question. While printing, signing, and scanning documents is one option for uploading information, there is also an electronic signature program available which will help streamline this process and cut down on the time and resources required to upload documents. The process for establishing an electronic signature solution is detailed in the ITS Signature and Records Act, otherwise known as ERSA. You can also contact our Knowledge Management and Audit Support team for more information. The information for this team, known as KMAS, is kmas@osc.ny.gov, and they can be contacted for further information and assistance. This concludes our survey questions and answers. We hope you found this WebEx class interesting and helpful, and we again thank all of you who brought questions to us either in the survey or during the presentation. We tried to answer all questions submitted. However, if your question was not addressed, please feel free to reach out to us. We have included some links to useful resources agency staff can explore when conducting future procurements, and encourage you to use these as a foundation for expanding your procurement knowledge. In the difficult times of this unprecedented pandemic, OSC understands the difficulties agencies may be experiencing in getting contracts written, advertised, evaluated, signed, and sent to OSC. And we are here to support you and to help get your contracts to approval. We all have the state's best interests in mind, want to protect the state and its interests, want to make sure we get best price and best value, that we get a vendor who can provide what our agency needs, and want to make sure the state is protected in case there's a dispute. We encourage you to either call us or write to us if you have questions, or if you come across something you're unfamiliar with and would like some guidance on. We have provided the Bureau of Contracts general contact information for your reference. We'll also, again, provide Randy McConaughey's phone number if needed. His number is 518-486-1250. Thank you for joining our chat about contracts. And on behalf of Randy, Dave, Hannah, Jenny, Liz, myself, and all of us at the Bureau of Contracts, stay safe and stay healthy.